The room grew still after he asked his question. Shalltear looked up to him questioningly as she slowly repeated herself. "The truth of her work eludes us," she said. "It is as if all the mechanisms of this world only respond to her act, aren't you?" Pandora's actor straightened himself. He held his gauntleted hands up before him, absently staring down at the black metal encasing his fingers. "What a fool I have been," his soft words were filled with ruefulness and disdain. He slowly turned his hands over, then turned his palms upwards again. He flexed his fingers repeatedly until his hands finally balled up tightly into fists. "A fool!" His wailing shout filled the room. "To think that I, of all people, should have allowed this to escape my notice." Pandora's actor's voice smoldered as he continued to berate himself. "How great my hubris must have been, to have blinded me from this simple truth." Shalltear looked at him worriedly over his sudden change in disposition. Is everything all right, Aransuka?" she asked. "No. Everything was wrong," he cried in despair. "I was wrong about everything. To think that I, the greatest of actors in Zaradnik, had disregarded this piece of wisdom left by the supreme beings, until now. Thanks to your reminder, minor dame, everything is right again. It is not too late to act." He looked back down to his hands, still curled into fists, at the end of his words and opened them. Then a chuckle escaped his lips. The chuckle turned into a laugh, and the deep sound rose until it filled the room as he threw his head back uproariously, throwing his arms wide as his body shook. Bits of Momon's armor were unequipped in sequence, until only the militant mustard uniform of Pandora's actor remained. Its polished medals, buttons and chains glistened as he expressed his joy, and the worries that stained his thoughts were washed away. "What did I remind you of?" Shalltear's face was a mass of confusion. "I don't understand." Pandora's actor stilled his laughter, but his mirth remained. He looked back down to the vampire watching him from the couch. In a sudden move, he leaned over to lightly grasp Shalltear's fingers, pulling her gently from her seat as she let out a surprised noise. He swept her across the floor in an impromptu waltz, leading her through several joyful turns around the room. As the pair returned to where they had started, he paused dramatically to speak. "Die ganze Welt ist Buna." He led her into a final turn, raising his arm to twirl her out to arm's length. With his free hand, he removed his cap, holding it over his heart as he genuflected before his speechless partner. "Und alle Frauen und Männer bloß Spieler." He rose again, the atmosphere surrounding him undiminished. He continued to hold on to her fingers as he spoke. "I was a fool," he said quietly. "I perhaps thought myself above the others, who saw all who fell under the dominion of Zaradnik as new acquisitions, as pawns to be used to achieve the ends desired by our master. Yet I did just the same. I saw them as an audience, who only needed to respond to my act to produce the results that I desired. I see now that I was wrong. I see now what must be done. The people of this world are not like us, created to serve, existing assured in our purpose and common cause. Instead, they come together to develop civilizations with the cultures and societies that they have found to best suit their species in the circumstances that they each find themselves in. It is as much a part of them as our existence is to us. We cannot expect them to become something else simply because we fashion new paths that we arbitrarily decide are fit for them, even though they may rightly be so. The humans of this realm do not act out their lives on this stage alone. Their roles are intertwined with the roles of many others, and those other roles with their own intertwined. And so we must create a place where they can all act, and it must be a place where all newcomers can join the act as well, regardless of their origin. What we have built here so far, what we have planned to build in the future, is but a body without a soul, a sad puppet held aloft by the strings of our shallow machinations, bereft of the spark of life. A place for everything, and everything in its place, but not a place to be. For the sorceress kingdom to become what our master desires, all of its citizens must join on its stage, to act and sing and dance according to the roles that their lives lead them to fill. We knew this, we knew. Yet even as our eyes perceived it, we blindly refused the existence of beings so different from us. Before his seclusion, our master even helped establish the initial laws and policies of the realm, yet we were all blind to this truth that he so plainly pointed us to. We took the words that carried his will, words that we should have embraced wholly, and twisted them into conditions, challenges to be faced and defeated through artifice, contrivance or technicality. Shalltear listened attentively as he shared his explanation. She opened her mouth several times while he spoke, then closed it again without interrupting his words. When at last he finished, she asked a question. Then we should tell the others about this, no? The truth of the sorceress kingdom that Ein Summer wishes to create. You reported none of what you told me tonight at this evening's council meeting, he replied. Why is that? Because I didn't think something like this would matter to the others, aren't you? Indeed, he said gravely, it would be to no avail. This truth is something they must arrive at on their own to understand in its full depth. You were the first, I think, though you understand it intuitively rather than in any manner that can be wholly articulated. Some of the others may have grasped hints of it as well, but they do not appear to be fully aware of it yet. If they are simply told, it will just be treated as a new set of conditions to be approached in the same manner as before. Pandora's actor looked down at the cool, deceptively delicate fingers that he still grasped within his own. He hesitated a moment before speaking again. I must ask you, Shalltear Bloodfallen, just as we have danced here in this room, would you join me in this dance that all must eventually join in order for the sorceress kingdom to become what it needs to be? Not simply as a pawn, or as a convenience, but as a fellow servant of Zaradnik who would see the true wishes of our master fulfilled, to become a leading actor in his great work that would turn this dream within a dream into an impossible and glorious reality. Shalltear gave him a long look, and withdrew her fingers from his grasp. Pandora's actor felt his heart sink. He did not look back up, instead watching as the vampire crossed her arms over her abdomen. Yesterday, at the council meeting, her voice emerged, measured and calm. Was it your ploy to have Baroness Zaradnik come under my authority, aren't you? Yes. Yet you came to this revelation only just now, she noted. Sabos would be a much more suitable candidate if you wanted to find a benevolent individual for her to serve under, so why? Because he is not qualified. He answered simply, he is too kind, too benevolent, to the point where it can blind him to the consequences of his well-meaning actions. If the Baroness had been placed under him, she would not have pursued the course that she had, in order to work out her problems in the ways that she knew how. She would have been provided with everything she needed, and we would have gained nothing for it. Furthermore, he added, Sabos is not a floor guardian. If ever a time came when the Baroness required more substantial support, he would not have the authority nor the resources to provide it. The others might argue that the opposite is true for myself, aren't you? Shalltear pointed out. I'm fairly certain Yuri Alpha thought I was going to devour Baroness Zaradnik the moment I had her alone. I did not believe that would happen, Pandora's actor replied. You are not like that. The others may believe you to only be an engine of chaos and destruction, but I believe that you have other, more important traits that make you the ideal candidate for taking the Baroness under your wing. You see, I made a great study of everyone and everything I could when I entered into this world from my seclusion in the treasury. You were no exception. You are the strongest amongst the floor guardians and you oversee the greatest number of floors, yet your domain is filled with the weakest of Nazarik's denizens and you are well accustomed to managing them. Though you may not understand what it means to be weak, you are still able to intuit the capabilities of those under you for any given circumstance. You are attentive to your area guardians, even as you diligently perform your duties patrolling your floors, and you will only severely punish those that fail in tasks that they should have been capable of accomplishing in the first place. I believed that, once the Baroness had become your vassal, her treatment would not differ all that much from this, even as an outsider. I see. He could still not detect any change in Shalltear's tone. Is there anything else? There is one more thing, he added. The most important thing, though I feel that I may anger you if I speak of it. I think I'm becoming angry just by hearing you say that. Pandora's actor was not sure if she had said the last in jest or not. That it came out in the same measured tone that was entirely uncharacteristic of the usually expressive vampire made the prospect all the more terrifying. He could usually turn to his doppelganger abilities to skim the thoughts of those around him, but, as one of the undead, Shalltear was immune to this. He decided that he should check her disposition before going further, but, to his surprise, her face seemed as calm as her voice when he finally looked up. He held her gaze for several moments before speaking again. It is because you are the greatest of the floor guardians, yet even as you are, you have also experienced the greatest failure. Your pride, the supremely self-assured pride that we have in our being creations of the supreme beings, has been shattered. Everyone, including you yourself, stands ever ready to examine your faults, no matter how insignificant they may seem. You are broken, Shalltear Bloodfallen, and because you are broken you are the most eminently qualified. Pandora's actor resisted the urge to pace about as he hurled himself into his words. This was too important, and he poured all of his energy into conveying his thoughts to Shalltear, who continued to maintain the calm expression that gave none of her own away. Our master has done much in these past few months since our arrival in this strange new world, he continued. So many things he has done that seem so incomprehensible, yet there is one thing that we have all been made to feel keenly. Throughout this time, he has tested us, cast us into situations that lead to failure and defeat. He makes decisions that make us question our own abilities, to re-examine ourselves and the way that we perceive his will. All of us come out changed in ways we would not have conceived of as our former selves. This is the crucible that Ein Summer has cast us into. A creator's crucible. The crucible of the greatest of the supreme beings. We are left to be exposed to the flames of our trials, and those very flames burn away our impurities and prepare us to be forged anew. It is for you, Shalltear Bloodfallen, that these flames have burned the brightest, the hottest. All has been taken away, leaving only the very essence of yourself. I believe that you have been ready to be reforged for our master's purposes for some time now. With the revelation of this evening, I am even more convinced of this. The scales of pride and presumption have fallen from your eyes, and, in this new realm of our master, all the experiences of your travels, all of the duties you are assigned, will be the hammer blows that will forge you into the instrument of his supreme will. Be it as his lance or his lady, you shall be the one that binds the people of this world together on the grand stage of his great work. Shalltear's expression did not change, even as he concluded his appeal. The silence which followed his heartfelt outpouring stretched for a minute, then two, and Pandora's actor dared not to break it lest he mar her decision in some way. The quiet rustle of silken skirts was the first sound to fill the room as Shalltear turned to walk away. With unhurried steps, she went past the couch and around the table. The handle of her black parasol appeared over her wrist. With his cap still held over his chest, Pandora's actor turned to watch her as she made her way back to the window by which she had entered. The window was opened, and the sound of the rain outdoors dampened his spirits even as his mind raced to salvage the situation. I thought I finally understood. Everything was in place. Where did I go wrong? Was it something I said? How did I fail? As he berated himself, finding more flaws, more possibilities and potential problems in his performance, the rain continued in its cold accompaniment. He looked up from his thoughts and moved to close the window, then stopped when he saw that Shalltear had not yet left. She was gazing up at the night sky, the lazy curls of her silver hair framing the pale beauty of her face. She did not turn to face him as she spoke, continuing to watch the downpour. His breath caught when he finally heard her decision over the sound of the rain. I will play my part, she said softly. For Ein Summer's sake. Amelia sat up from her bed with a start. Abruptly waking in the night was a common thing in Nirantal as of late, with the citizens sleeping fitfully after the shadow of the undead sorcerer king fell over the land. Like many others, she had become a mess of looming fears and frayed nerves in the past week since the city was ceded. The heavy metallic tread of the monstrous undead patrols, the sense that something evil had just flown over her roof, and the nightmares which haunted her dreams would all take turns prodding her into fearful wakefulness layered in a sheen of cold sweat. The exhaustion made her hours out of bed seem a waking nightmare which blurred from one day into the next. The reason for her sudden panic this time, however, was caused by none of these. Instead it was because she had, for the first time in what seemed an eternity, slept soundly. The previous evening, Amelia had flopped onto her bed after ensuring her mistress was settled for the night, and by the time she stirred again the light of dawn was peeking out from behind the curtains of the room's windows. Alarmed by the idea that she might have slept in, her eyes shot open and she dashed out from beneath her covers. Tiptoeing to the drapes, she opened the windows of her bedchamber to banish the drowsiness that still clung to her with the chill of the morning air. Amelia tossed her nightwear into the room's laundry basket and quickly slipped into a fresh woolen shift. She moved on to prepare the rest of her outfit, and the only point in her frenzied activity where she slowed was when she took her time to ensure that her uniform and general appearance met the standards of presentability befitting a maid. Looking at herself in the body-length mirror that stood beside her dresser, she allowed herself a smile at the sight of the uniformed woman looking back at her, a senior member of a noble household, holding a position of honor and respect. The smile continued to creep and grow despite her efforts to straighten it off her face. Tears came to her eyes as the reflection of the maid in the mirror made memories of the journey that her life had taken up to this point drift to the forefront of her thoughts. Well, it wasn't exactly a journey that spanned great distances. She was born in Irantal, to common parentage. Her father was a tailor, her mother a seamstress. They had met at their shared place of work, a large workshop that catered mostly to producing clothing for the laborers of the city, and, while the stories conflicted about whether they had a child and had gotten married or the other way around, they remained together to lovingly raise their family with 3 children in the humble apartment where she had grown up. Amelia's brother, her sister and herself all followed in their parents' footsteps, starting near the age of 6, slowly picking up their craft as children usually did. Presently, her brother, the eldest of the 3, had already become a journeyman in the same store that their parents worked in. Her older sister also completed her apprenticeship, but had gotten married and moved to another part of the city a year previous. Amelia's own apprenticeship had not gone as smoothly, at least in the eyes of her own family. While she clearly had an interest in clothing and fashion, the line of work that her family engaged in had a distinct lack of the latter, which resulted in her being constantly on the lookout for new opportunities even as she became familiar with the skills and workings of her family's trade. Inspiration came one day when a storm in the form of a woman of average height and mature appearance swept into the rough storefront of the workshop. From the corner of her workspace nearby, her younger self peeked up from her tasks as the shop's clerk was sent scurrying off to find the owner with not much more than a few words spoken with a quiet, but firm tone. To her surprise, what had sent the man running appeared not to be an influential noble or wealthy merchant, nor was it a famous adventurer or a powerful magic caster. Instead, what stood waiting in front of the counter was a woman dressed in the uniform of a maid. She continued observing from her inconspicuous vantage as the master tailor himself came to attend directly to the woman's presence. To Amelia's astonishment, the prideful and haughty owner of the workshop had turned one-sidedly servile in the face of the woman that she had considered at the time a menial servant. Most of the afternoon passed as she watched him work to carefully note the maid's instructions, which defined the attire of an entire household staff in intricate detail, his hands endlessly moving to fill sheet after sheet of preliminary drafts to satisfactorily meet her demands. He did not argue, contradict or make excuses, he simply kept his head low to the table as if there was some invisible hand firmly holding him there. After they were finished, she turned to leave and a footman, who Amelia had not even noticed standing in the room the entire time, opened the door for her. It was only after the carriage that had been awaiting them rolled away did the master tailor dare to move, exploding into a flurry of action and shouting orders as he ran back into the workspace beyond the counter. He suspended everyone's current tasks to fulfill the maid's order as quickly as possible, and the entire workshop was spurred in his wake. That evening, when she had returned home with her family, she had learned that the maid who had visited the shop was the housekeeper of Count Jessen's primary manor. The young nobleman had recently inherited his office, and his household staff was receiving new uniforms to represent the change in leadership. Amelia's mother had gone into some detail about what it meant, not daring to relate her knowledge in any way that could be construed as speaking ill of the maid, as if she was some existence far above her own. To her mother's shock and horror, Amelia immediately declared that she wanted to become a maid after the explanation. Her mother tearfully called for her father, and Amelia found herself facing both angry and worried opposition. The proud figure of Count Jessen's unnamed maid had already become etched in her mind, however, and their warnings of how difficult and dangerous it was to become part of a noble's household had fallen on deaf ears. Fortunately for Amelia, the Empire's annual challenges had already become a regular occurrence, so the yearly influx of visiting nobles that came to represent themselves on the field also meant that the guest houses of the administrative district faced a steep increase in demand for temporary maids at the same time. For a few months out of every year, she would step away from her apprentice's duties, to the continued opposition of her parents, and earn her keep while training and serving as a maid. The transient nature of the position meant that she spent most of her time as a poorly paid between maid, but it suited her perfectly well since it allowed her to observe many of a noble household's domestic activities in detail. She did not even mind the cold, bare accommodations that accompanied her low-ranked and unaffiliated position, instead focusing her efforts on slowly cultivating the forms of etiquette and awareness that were required for the close servants of nobility, as well as learning to read and write at a level she thought would be needed for the position that she coveted. After several years of this temporary work, Amelia felt that she had a firm enough grasp to begin pursuing a position as a permanent member of a noble's household staff. Unfortunately for her, she had very little in the way of gaining the notice of her prospective employers. She had very few interactions with the upper household maids and senior staff. The afternoon in the tailor's workshop had actually been the closest and longest she had been to one, even after all those years working as hired help. The position that she desired, which was that of a lady's maid, saw extraordinary competition to be the direct attendant of a high-ranking noblewoman or one serving the consort of a noble house. It was essentially mandatory to be a noble oneself, as their duties overlapped with those who sought to become a lady-in-waiting to a noble family. Even the housekeeper that had inspired her to pursue her path she had discovered later to be a daughter of one of House Jessen's noble vassals. This narrowed her prospects down to serving a house that held a minor title, a baron at most, or perhaps in the secondary manner of a higher-ranking noble or one of their cadet branches, though it was more likely that she would see her best chance aiming for a position serving the least prominent of noble families. Amelia had spent the better part of the year deciding on what she would need to do to get her proverbial foot in the door. Even becoming a mistress to gain favor for the position was not out of the question, though she wasn't really confident she could compete in that arena. Then, the Battle of Katza Plains brought reality crashing down around her. She could only stand by helplessly as the nobles fled to the toll of the city bells accompanying the news of the royal army's catastrophic defeat on the field. Lord Rettenmeier and his entire administrative staff quickly vacated themselves, leaving the citizens to their fate. When the Sorcerer King entered the gates at the turn of spring to claim his prize, she felt as if all of her efforts had been for naught. Strangely enough, it was then that the door she had long sought to open presented itself. As the servants of the Sorcerer King took their places in the city, so did a handful of maids which hailed from the mysterious place. She still had no idea where or what it was that had occupied her city. Most notably for her were Yuri Alpha and Swenanya Veyron, humans who did not flinch or cower in the presence of the undead that filled the streets. They went around the city looking for the people that formerly served as maids in the central district, and, when they came knocking at her door, Amelia had desperately grasped at the opportunity much like a drowning person would grasp at a straw. Taking her to be sequestered away in one of the now empty guest manors in the administrative district, she was trained for the following week by Swenanya. Though meek in appearance, the new head maid in Iranthal put her through her paces alongside several other candidates that were gathered from around the city, smoothing down and polishing all the rough edges that Amelia thought she had already refined to an acceptable degree. All throughout that week, Yuri Alpha observed the proceedings, though it seemed that she was watching Swenanya's harsh methods as much as the performance of the maids under her instruction. Still, as Yuri continued to hover about worriedly like a mother hen over the head maid who seemed far inferior to her own regal bearing, Amelia was constantly wary of the switch that the tall and stern-looking woman seemed to constantly brandish for some unknown reason. By the end of it all, she felt very much like a rock that had been tumbled in a keg of sand, but she could hardly argue with the results. After attaining the degree of cultivation that the head maid in Iranthal decided was acceptable, Amelia was placed on standby for assignment as the next batch of maid candidates was brought in to face their own evaluation and retraining. Left to wait on her assignment, worries and uncertainty piled on once again, adding to the general unease that she felt accompanying the inhuman occupation of the city. Her wandering thoughts caused her to wonder if she would even end up in the retinue of an inhuman being. She prayed that she would not find herself in the employ of some horrid, flesh-eating monstrosity, especially not one of the undead. Her time spent idle only served to add fuel to her nightmares. When she next saw Yuri Alpha, who came accompanied by a pair of death knights, she thought her heart would leap out of her chest as she was led away into the night to what felt like her own funeral. The procession picked up 3 other women along the way and, under their umbrellas amidst the pouring rain, they were led to a dark and foreboding manor that seemed to be entirely unoccupied. Much to her relief, while they waited at the door for someone to answer the bell, Yuri explained that the mistress residing in the manor was a human noblewoman who had recently arrived from the borderlands. After waiting for several minutes in the rain with no response, the royal maid launched herself onto the roof of the manor directly from where she was standing before the door. It must have been at least 7 or 8 meters, and the maids below gaped in astonishment, uncaring of the rain streaming over their faces. Following their entrance, Amelia gathered what courage she had left and volunteered ahead of the others to see to the noblewoman's immediate needs, and so she was introduced to Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik. If she were to be honest with herself, she wasn't sure what to expect. Her mind was only filled with relief over the fact that she would thankfully be serving a human rather than some strange and unfamiliar being. When they had been brought to the Baroness Solar, Lady Zaradnik was in the process of upending her clothing from her luggage onto the bed in a messy and disorganized pile. The young woman, in her plain rough-spun kirtle that carried the odors of soil and vegetation, projected the image of a commoner from a poor, rural region of the duchy. The underlying impression of the Baroness, however, conveyed a sense of dissonance with her rather uninspiring appearance. There was a tugging sensation, nearly an instinct, in the corner of the maid's mind that the woman sorting through the chaotic pile of her belongings was definitely not what she appeared to be. This was confirmed almost immediately, when a death knight came stomping into the room, sending Terra and herself scurrying to the furthest corner of the Solar in fright. The Baroness didn't even bat an eyelash at the entrance of the undead monstrosity. Her only reaction was to instruct it to draw her bath, after which she continued to go about her business before it even fully left. It was not long after that both maids had been swept up in her pace, their training taking over as if they had been compelled to attend to her. Well, to say she was compelled would not be entirely correct, less so than being forced to act. Her mind's eye saw the place where she should fit, and she had naturally moved to fill the needs with the skills that had been cultivated through years of training and experience. By the time they had completed her dress, Amelia was convinced that her decision to become a lady's maid had been correct, and she silently promised herself that she would not let this golden opportunity get away from her. Her commitment to her lady's service only strengthened over the course of the next day. It felt as if her heart and spirit had been rallied out of the grey uncertainty that had clouded her mind. The fear that she had for the undead still lingered, but it no longer dominated her waking hours as she grew accustomed to her newfound place. Now, as she looked in the mirror, she thought she could see a glimmer of the proud maid that had set her on her course as a child. The sounds of the kitchen below drew her away from her reflection. She needed to ensure that her mistress' portion for breakfast was larger today. Yesterday's meal seemed insufficient. The industrious Baroness appeared to have an appetite to match her drive. She would then head to Lady Zaradnik's Solar to help her prepare for the coming days. At the behest of her liege, Lady Shalltear Bloodfallen, the Baroness would depart for her domain today, a trip that she said would take roughly 3 days by way of the Katza River. Amelia would be accompanying her mistress, while the others would stay to tend to the manor in the city. A growing sense of adventure and excitement grew as she left her room and started her duties for the day. Daydreams followed as she wondered what sort of magnificent territory her new mistress ruled over. Most of the morning had passed by the time the Soul Eater drove its wagon, bearing the noble and her lady's maid, within viewing distance of Corlin village. Ludmilla had planned on leaving the city much earlier, but she underestimated how much time it would take to sort out the household business that she decided to leave in Terra's hands. New staff for the manor would need to be hired to see to daily domestic matters as times became busier, and retainers that could see about the business of running the fief needed to be identified and recruited. She had left the footman at the guest manor with Terra and the Lionham sisters to help with security, as unlikely as any incidents seemed within the city. The labor force that had been equipped and marched off overland to the barony was likely more than adequate enough to serve as an impromptu village militia in the event that they did encounter trouble out on the frontier. While the maids were plainly not enthused about the prospect of the undead hanging about on a prolonged basis, they did not appear as fearful as when she had first met them. She left her instructions, and she told them that if they needed any work done that would normally be handled by footmen, they should just ask the death knights who were available in front of the manor. The newly appointed housekeeper already seemed overwhelmed by her new responsibilities, but Ludmilla hoped that slipping in the suggestion would produce the desired results eventually. After all her instructions for the staff of the city manor were settled, Ludmilla made a short stop at Clara's residence, paid the harbour fees that she owed to her, and then set off on the first leg of the trip home. Her work now would draw the scrutiny of the central administration, as they examined all aspects related to the industries and logistics of the realm. For this same reason, there was no gate or teleportation-assisted travel provided as there was before. As the harbour village grew closer, she peered down the slope of the valley at the rows of buildings to see if she could spot any activity from its tenants. Much to her surprise, she immediately noticed figures moving around the houses. Several more were on the dusty road that ran between the village and the highway, following the course of the river valley. As several turned their notice to the wagon which was steadily approaching from the city, Ludmilla instructed the Solita to stop where the rural road intersected with the southern highway, recalling the terrified girl that had run screaming from the Death Knights at the harbour. "Why have we stopped, my lady?" Amelia asked in confusion as the wagon slowed to a halt. "We'll be walking to the harbour from here," Ludmilla replied, pulling the bags out from behind the seat of the wagon. "I'm not sure how well those villagers would respond to having a soul-eater trot into their midst." They had 4 bags between the two of them, with most of Ludmilla's personal purchases from Mesmet's forge bundled up together separately in a tarp. Amelia had snatched up 3 of the bags before she could say anything, insisting that it was her job to carry their things, so Ludmilla ended up shouldering only 1 bag over her round shield while holding the bundle of equipment in one arm. As the sound of the wagon receded into the distance, Ludmilla eyed her retainer as she shuffled under the weight of the luggage. "Are you sure you'll be all right?" she asked. "I'll be fine, my lady," her maid quickly replied. "It is my duty as your lady's maid, after all." As they made their way forward, the scraping of Amelia's steps drew Ludmilla's gaze to her maid's feet. She was wearing shoes suited for the city, which peeked out from under the long skirts of her uniform. The attire as a whole was clearly not meant for rough country roads or muddy village lanes. She looked about to tumble in a tangle of bags and skirts at any point. Ludmilla tried thinking of ways to diplomatically get her stubborn attendant to hand over at least one of the bags, but, after over a minute of travel with the sound of her feet scraping heavily over the dry dirt road, she stopped to turn back to face her maid. "Hand me one of those bags," she told Amelia as she laid her spear against her shoulder and held out her hand. "You're going to ruin your uniform at this rate." Amelia pouted stubbornly, but, seeing her mistress' firm expression, she finally relented. Her shoes continued to shuffle over the road lightly on occasion as they continued walking, but at least she did not look like she was about to fall over. "We need to see about getting you some boots," Ludmilla said after a while as they approached the border of the village. "Those shoes won't last long out on the border." "Will that be necessary, my lady?" Amelia's voice came from beside her as she picked up her pace. "I thought I'd be mostly working out of your manner." "You'll still need to move around the village," Ludmilla replied. "The only properly paved roads in the duchy are the main highways, as well as the major thoroughfares in Rantel. Most of the land has roads like the one you're walking on right now. Warden's Vale sees a lot more rain than the lowlands, so the paths are often slick and muddy. Wearing shoes meant for cobbled city streets will have you constantly falling and you'll eventually injure yourself." They passed several laborers on their way out to the vineyards, who nodded to them as they crossed each other on the village road. Though there were fewer people than there should have been outdoors at this time of day, it was a stark difference from the empty surroundings that Ludmilla had arrived at the day before. The smells of lunch being prepared wafted over the air as men and women worked near their homes, doing laundry, preparing tools and going back and forth from the shops at the center of the settlement as they readied themselves for the season's activities. As they approached the village square, 2 armed men, in the cobalt and silver livery of House Corlin, standing watch at one of the corners of the square, stepped away from their post to walk up to them. In addition to their gambesons laid over with shining steel mail, they wore kettle helmets and dull, polished gorgets. Both held steel bucklers and spears roughly the same length as Ludmilla's own, and at their belts each had a war hammer on one hip and a long dagger on the other. Their appearance was a testament to the wealth of House Corlin. Each member of Clara's baronial militia were better armed and armored than Ludmilla herself. One of the pair stopped roughly 4 meters away while the other came forward to address them. With salt and pepper hair and a balanced posture that lent him the air of experience, he appeared a militia veteran they might have come across keeping an eye on any bustling village or town. His clear gaze went from the taller woman dressed in a villager's kirtle but carrying a variety of weapons, to the shorter maid standing slightly behind her to the side. He relaxed his cautious posture somewhat and spoke deferentially to Ludmilla, probably assuming Amelia was an attendant of some sort. "Welcome to Corlin Village, miss." His gravelly voice came out evenly, not quite matching the warmth of his words. "What is your business here today?" "We're headed to Warden's Vale," Ludmilla replied as she rested her spear against her shoulder again and fished around in her bags. "Here is the receipt for the harbour fees." The man took the folded piece of paper that was offered to him, opening it up to scan over its content. His eyes rose to glance at her for a moment before turning to walk back to his partner, discussing something quietly between themselves. "Is something the matter?" Ludmilla asked. The two men exchanged looks before facing her again. "There's nothing wrong with your receipt, miss," the older man spoke again, "but the boat is—" His voice trailed off with some uncertainty as he tried to find words to explain. After leaving her hanging for a moment, he gave up and resumed speaking. "Well, you can see for yourself." They followed after the two militia sentries, who led them down the southern village road that ended at the harbour, but, well before they arrived, the pair stopped. Ludmilla came out from behind them to see what the delay was. In the distance she could see the figure of the elder lich standing on the shore near the pier. She had wondered whether her attaché would be accompanying them on their journey. Now she supposed she had her answer. In addition to the undead clerk, however, she spotted several other figures on the vessel itself. Ludmilla frowned, stepping forward with Amelia in tow. When she was close enough to make out the figures sitting in the vessel, she realized that they were a group of undead. A skeleton sat at each of the 8 oars, another manned the rudder while 2 others appeared unoccupied. The undead standing at the rudder was not one she had seen before. It had a similar appearance to the Death Knights that stood as sentries around Rantel, but lacked the huge cowl shield and carapace-like plate armor. In their stead was some sort of armor fashioned from hides, appearing worn and ancient. A great many strips of cloth, resembling the ones that hung off of the elder liches, were wrapped about its head and body, their ends fluttering in the breeze. Between the gaps of its adornment, she could see the desiccated flesh belonging to a being of times long past. She thought that it might have once been a human, but time had taken its toll and worn away many of its features, leaving a ruin that only suggested what may have been. The blade of a great sword rested on its shoulder, and its right hand cradled the pommel before its waist. At its belt, there hung a great quantity of sidearms. She even spotted several weapons meant to be thrown, in addition to a crossbow. Holding her own newly purchased equipment, Ludmilla felt a bit inadequate compared to the warrior standing in the boat. Unlike her gleaming weapons freshly forged, the weapons had the sense of being well-worn and trusted companions to the ancient warrior through all of the ages it had seen. She perceived the Death Knights as stalwart and unyielding defenders, but this undead being looked like the very personification of unholy violence, its armament ready to be unleashed at any moment. "What's going on here?" Ludmilla asked her attaché as she approached the pier. "The royal treasurer has assigned a crew for this vessel." Amelia jumped in surprise as the elder lich replied. Apparently it had used some sort of magic to conceal itself and the maid had not noticed its presence near to them. Ludmilla was somewhat confused by the archaic term that had been used. The position of royal treasurer had long been replaced by the Minister of Finance in Riestais. She wondered if the office was similar, and why it still existed in the sorcerer's kingdom. Aside from that, she had never met the royal treasurer, nor any other member of the king's cabinet aside from Lady Shalltear. "Are there any terms or arrangements involving the use of this crew?" "The administration did not account for the use of ships in this region," the elder lich replied, "so the employer of an undead crew is currently being evaluated. Fees associated with their usage will be determined after the value of the service has been assessed." "So these crew members don't know how to operate a ship?" Ludmilla said dubiously after the explanation, but the elder lich gave no further reply. She glared at her attaché for a while, then sighed. There was ultimately nothing she could do about it. It still felt strange that a member of the royal court she had never met or heard of before would intervene in her matters directly. She pondered the matter for a while until she decided that, unlike the Duchy of Rantel, whose primary trade routes lay on land, the sorceress kingdom viewed ships as a tool for trade, so the treasurer had become involved. Stepping onto the pier near the ship, she held out one of her bags experimentally. The unassigned skeleton nearest to her took the luggage and stowed it away into the hold while the second came up, reaching out with its arms for the other bag she was holding. After they had stashed her things away, Ludmilla turned to look at her maid. With some hesitation, Amelia stepped forward and held out the first bag she was carrying. Her arms were stretched to their full extent, and her face was turned away with her eyes squeezed shut even as she gingerly leaned forward. The awaiting undead crewman, for its part, seemed entirely uncaring of her presentation and simply took the bag out of her hands, stowing it away with the rest of the articles already on board. Since nothing terrible had happened to her, Amelia handed over the other bag in a slightly more normal fashion. Relieved of their burdens, Ludmilla turned and walked back towards the village, placing her hand on the small of Amelia's back to guide her forward, lest she bump her into the water. She paused in her steps as they passed in front of the invisible elder lich. "I'll be in the village a while. There are a few things we need to purchase before departure."